Hello natural science students, welcome back. So, what I want to start getting into today is briefly go over some of the concepts behind the damage caused by earthquakes and then look at some examples of earthquakes. We've got a lot of material to get through, so I want to kind of go through this fairly quickly and really hit to some of the highlights here. But first thing I want to start with is measurement. How do we measure earthquakes? We do that with an instrument called a seismograph. And it produces what's called a seismogram, which is the record of that. Literally, it's a pen on a rotating cylinder that shakes back and forth with the ground and then leaves a trace of that shaking that you can then analyze. And we use that analysis to determine the strength of that actual earthquake event. So the ways that we can measure this or put a number on an earthquake, the most common one that we see as a number is what's called the Richter scale. How we come across measuring this number has changed fairly recently-ish. But the Richter scale is a measure of the largest surface wave in terms of its amplitude. It's a logarithmic scale. This is the thing to keep in mind with the Richter number that you read, is it's logarithmic, meaning that a 2 is not twice as bad as a 4. Right? A 3 is not a little bit worse than a 4. It's logarithmic. So every 1.0 change in magnitude means 10 times increase in the amount of shaking and roughly about a 32 times increase in the amount of energy involved in that event. So just some examples. If you're comparing a 5.1 to a 4.1 earthquake, that 5.1 has 10 times more motion and 32 times more energy. You compare a 7.1 versus a 5.1, that 7.1 has 100 times, 10 times 10, 100 times more energy, and 1,024 times, 100 times more motion and over 1,000 times more energy. So small increases in number, the Richter number, result in big changes in the amount of shaking, the amount of energy involved in that event. So, you know, when you're talking about a 5 versus a 6 magnitude earthquake, those are really, really different events. You really can't compare a 5 and a 6 or a 5 and a 4. Again, completely different events. You can't compare a 4 to a 6 or a 4 to a 7. I mean, they're just completely different. So keep that in mind with the Richter scale. Now, a better way to get the Richter number, and this is what we tend to do more these days, is what's called the moment magnitude. Moment magnitude is just a better overall measurement of the overall earthquake event. It incorporates much more data, so it takes a little longer to calculate, but the number you get is the same as a Richter scale number. So it's just a better, more accurate way to get to that number. So, you know, a 5.0 calculated by Richter scale has a little more error in it than a 5.0 calculated by moment magnitude, even though, again, the 5 is the same number, right? It's the same amount of shaking, same amount of energy released. It's just a more accurate way of getting to that number. You'll see, again, moment magnitude used quite a bit, but the number scale is the same, and it's also, again, logarithmic. You know, moment magnitude 6.0 earthquake is, again, same as a Richter magnitude 6.0. Another one that we use sometimes is what's called a modified Mercalli, and this is based purely on the damage caused by an earthquake. So it's kind of useful in that regard, but just purely based on the damage that we have in that earthquake event. So another way that we can measure earthquakes. All right, so let's get into earthquake damage. Now, some of this is like super simple and like duh kind of stuff, but I want to go through some of this in a little more detail than maybe you think it's worth, just because there are some subtle important differences. But a very important thing to start with when we think about earthquake damage is the following statement, which is not mine. I don't take credit for this, but it's a fairly widely used one in studying earthquakes. And that is, earthquakes don't kill people. Buildings do. If you think about any footage you've seen of bad earthquakes and that have killed people, the bodies aren't being picked out of open fields. The bodies in earthquakes are being pulled out of destroyed buildings, bridges that failed, tunnels that collapsed, infrastructure. So buildings, roads, things like that, infrastructure. So it's a silly little saying, but it's an important one for us to remember, because This will help us understand ultimately what we can do to make things safer in an earthquake. And what you do to make things safer in an earthquake is to have safer buildings. That's the number one thing. It would be great to predict earthquakes, but we are nowhere close to being able to predict earthquakes. So in the meantime, if we can't predict earthquakes, let's make our buildings safer. That is the number one thing we can do to save lives in earthquakes, reduce damage in terms of injuries and things like that to people, is to make safer buildings. And one way you do that is by educating people. There's a lot you can do on your own in your own house to make you safer. A lot of it is very low cost, and we'll talk about that as we go forward here. But now, let's think about what causes damage in an earthquake. Shaking from seismic waves. This is one of those duh moments. You all know this. It's the shaking from earthquakes that causes the damage. But it's the acceleration. It's the back and forth motion. Right? It's not just that you're pushing a building. You're pushing it, stopping it, pushing it the other way, stopping it, pushing it the other way, stopping it. And you're going back and forth, and that adds stress. That kind of shaking, we call it dynamic load, puts a lot of structure, a lot of stress on your structure, but it also puts a lot of stress on the stuff inside of your home. And this is where you can do a lot to make yourself safer. For example, if you have a bookshelf up against a wall and those two start shaking, they will inevitably start shaking at a different rate, and that bookshelf will fall over. So one very simple thing you can do to make things safer in your house, attach furniture to the walls. If you have a big china cabinet, attach it to the wall. If you have a big grandfather clock, attach it to the wall. If you have a bookcase, attach it to the wall. Because those things will come flying off and fall on whoever's nearby. Things like that. Cabinets in your kitchen, have them have some sort of latch on them. It doesn't have to be like a lock, but just a latch of some sort. A kitchen with drawers and cabinets that just open up freely, those will come flying open. And every dish, plate, glassware you own is going to be on the floor. And then if it's an earthquake in the middle of the night and you wake up and run the other part of the house to check on your kids, you're going to be running through the kitchen and stepping on broken glass. Right? Not a good scenario. So there's a lot of stuff you can do like that in your own house to help accommodate for this shaking that's going to take place. Now, another thing that shaking does besides just accelerating back and forth is what's called liquefaction. And this really is one of the biggest things that causes damage to structures on a large scale. When you shake the ground, particularly if that ground has loose material, loose sand, things like that in it, that ground will start to almost go through what's called liquefaction. It's almost like it becomes liquid or behaves like a liquid. It's not actually liquid, but it behaves kind of like it. And what happens is buildings tend to sink into the ground, and inevitably they sink unevenly. So you can see this part of the structure sank relative to this part and caused tremendous structural damage. That again, the more damage you have, the harder it is to survive that kind of event. So generally speaking, whenever you see buildings that are kind of tilted, not 90 degrees to each other after earthquakes, almost always you've got liquefaction in that event. Almost always. So it's acceleration and liquefaction from shaking that causes most of the problems when it comes to earthquakes. Fault offset, if you built your structure right across the fault and there's movement along that fault, you're going to come across, again, a tremendous amount of damage. Here you see a bridge. You can see the earthquake fault right through there. That suffered tremendously. Here you see another one with a running track here that suffered, again, a tremendous amount of damage. So, now I like to think about all that we've talked about so far as what I call primary damage. It's a result of the actual shaking of the ground and the fault offset, primary damage. We have a lot of secondary damage, though. Secondary events, secondary disasters that can occur. Mass wasting events, landslides, rock falls, very common. Fires, you can get fires started as a result of earthquakes. Power lines falling down, right? It's going to cause fires. Floods, whether it be locally with a water main breaking, or a pipe in your house, or a dam failing. So you're going to have floods potentially. Tsunamis. Earthquakes are a very common trigger for tsunamis. So again, something to worry about. Then you have sort of these long-term secondary events like starvation, disease, things like that. that can take weeks or months after the event are still causing problems. Sometimes it takes weeks for them to even start. So you can have a lot of long-lasting effects from an earthquake via other types of disasters. Now, the amount of damage you're going to have is going to be the result of earthquake itself, different characteristics of the earthquake. Duration's an interesting one here to think about too. How long did that event last? Was it a 5-second earthquake? Was it a 30-second earthquake? Was it a 2-minute earthquake? Right? It varies quite a bit. And then the location. What is it about that location that makes that shaking worse or better? It's the type of soil, dirt, the rocks beneath the surface. Again, liquefaction. Geologic structures, what we call synclines and anticlines, can greatly impact the type of shaking that you have at the surface. So all these can play a role in the type of damage that you have. And then infrastructure characteristics, building quality. You have the building code and enforcement that you have. Fortunately, Southern California has a very strong building code and pretty good enforcement of that building code. The height of the structure, taller buildings shake more. The infrastructure type, is it a house? Is it made out of concrete? Is it a bridge? Is it made out of steel? All those types of characteristics are really important. One important thing that I want to talk about with infrastructure type is a building type with a weak floor. So one floor of that structure that's designed very differently than the rest of them. And a very common example of this is where we have a structure with garage space built underneath. You see a lot of apartments and condos built here in Southern California that are like this. And the reason they do that is they want to maximize their space. So you want to have space for the cars, but you don't want to waste your real estate by putting just a parking lot. You want to be able to build essentially on top of that. But to do that, your bottom floor has to be a lot more open. You can't have, again, 4 walls, right? You have to have openness for cars to get in and out and open their doors and get in and out, things like that. So you end up with a lot of structures that look like this, that if they're not built well, can be very deficient when it comes to shaking, because the supports here are quite often not strong enough. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying every building you see like this is dangerous, but a lot of these kind of structures were built in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and they're not up to modern building code in many cases. And when they start shaking, that ground floor collapses and the building falls on top of it. This is from Northridge earthquake back in 1994. So again, it's that bottom floor here that becomes weak and becomes a potential a threat. Now you can retrofit these, you can make them safer, but they are, again, if they're not built to modern code, they are suspect at the very least, and a bit worrisome. So again, you can go in and retrofit them, but that just, again, it costs money to do that. It's not cheap. But older buildings with raised foundations, again, tend to be weaker. You can retrofit those buildings, but again, it takes money to do that. Again, I spent several $1,000s retrofitting my house, but it's something that's allowed me to sleep better at night, that's for sure. Not all buildings are built poorly. There's plenty of well-built buildings that have lots of cross bracing to tie all these floors in together, and that's great and all that. So what I want to jump to next, real quick, is looking at some examples of earthquakes. And we'll start with the big one here in California. That's the 1906 earthquake. This is the deadliest natural disaster in California history. This was estimated to be about a 7.8 earthquake. That is most likely bigger than anyone in this class has experienced. Certainly, if you've lived your whole life here in California, you've never experienced an earthquake and remotely this big, anywhere close to this. Lasted for about 40 seconds, had nearly 300 miles of rupture, 28 feet of offset, killed about 3,000 people between the earthquake and the fire that resulted in San Francisco after this. About a quarter of the city burned, about half the residents were homeless. And this is just a fault start from that. Some liquefaction in San Francisco. This is San Francisco City Hall beforehand, and then afterwards. So before and after here, this is the entrance to Stanford University. This is a famous picture looking down some of the hills of San Francisco with the fire in the background burning its way up the hill. This is a picture of San Francisco burning from the water. And in here you can just see the overall devastation in San Francisco. So horrible one there. I know I'm going kind of quick here, but just to hit the highlights here. San Fernando quake back in 1971, 6.6 killed 65 people. of note in this earthquake was the failure of the freeway interchange between the I-5 and the 14. That's heading up towards Santa Clarita, as we come across that. It failed. And however, it was under construction at the time. They were building it, so there were no cars actually on the road when this failed, when the earthquake hit, fortunately, because it was under construction. But it did fail. We had the near failure of a dam nearby. Fortunately, it didn't fail completely, but it was pretty scary there for a while because it looked like it might collapse. But fortunately, they were able to pump the water out. Loma Prieta, 1989, up in the Bay Area. That was a 7.1. 67 people died in that one. The Bay Bridge failed. We've since replaced that bridge. It took about almost 25 years to replace the bridge, but finally replaced the bridge with a modern, safe one. We had a massive freeway structure failure on the east side of the bay in Oakland, and most of the fatalities in this earthquake came from this stretch of freeway there. Northridge earthquake, 1994. This is going to seem a little similar here. This was a 6.7, killed 61 people. We had a lot of these types of weaker floored structures we talked about that failed in this event. In particular in and around Northridge, the epicenter area. A lot of these, again, that were built in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. We have a lot of freeway structures that failed due to lack of rebar. We've since changed building code as a result of that, so you see a lot more rebar in modern structures compared to old ones. And we had failure of the 514 interchange again. What's scary is this failed in the San Fernando quake in 71, but they didn't change the design. They just rebuilt it basically the same way they did before, and sure enough, it failed again. Here's hoping the third time that they built it is better. Certainly it should be. They built it to modern building code after Northridge, but just ridiculous. Should never have failed a second time, but unfortunately it did. All right. Mexico City real quick. What makes Mexico City earthquake back in, this is 85 and 8.1. What makes this one so unusual is so much of the destruction and death was so far from the epicenter. Mexico City itself, 215 miles from the epicenter of the earthquake. That's an astonishingly far away distance to have that much damage in downtown Mexico City. Now the reason for that is Mexico City is built on a dry lake bed, which tends to really go through a lot of liquefaction. So there was a great amplification of those seismic waves from liquefaction. And the shaking of the waves matched that of buildings between 6 and 16 stories. So there was an unusually heavy amount of damage of buildings between 6 and 16 stories. Very, very, very strange earthquake event, and a very devastating one. Estimates run in terms of fatalities as high as maybe 12,000 people in that, maybe even 14,000 people from that earthquake event. Just devastating. One last one, the Ridgecrest earthquakes from just a couple of years ago, or just about a year ago, I should say, last summer. We had on July 4th a 6.4. Turns out that's what we call a foreshock. So it was an earthquake, a large earthquake, but that precedes a bigger one. And the bigger one came just a day later, which was a 7.1. And again, a 7.1 is very different than a 6.4. Right? Big difference in those events. This was the largest earthquake in Southern California in nearly 20 years. I know a lot of you probably felt that here. I was not here. I missed it. So bummed out I missed it. But this is on a blind strike-slip fault, so we did not know this fault existed prior to this earthquake. So that's kind of scary. There was one fatality, unfortunately, in this earthquake, but it could have been a lot worse. Had that hit in a more populated area, the number of fatalities would have been a lot larger from that one. So you can see sort of the offset here. So this is just a before and after photo. You can see the offset right there from that strike-slip fault along that road in particular right there. You can see again offset here. This is the fault in a more remote area. You can see the offset there between those two images. More offset pictures there. So just some cool ones and some of the damage that you saw from that. So anyway, a little bit longer video, but a lot of material to get through on this particular set of material. So as always, any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thanks.